I'm here to talk about Microsoft Windows and layered products of Microsoft on top of Amazon Web Services, right? How many of you use Windows or other layered products in some shape or form, whether in the cloud or not? Okay, that's a decent one. So this should be useful for you, right? Let's take the first slide, right? Let's hope that this is clear with everyone, right? There is nothing weird about running Windows on the Amazon platform, right? It is incredibly simple to spin up a Windows instance, a Windows operating system, 2003, 2008, or 2008 R2, right? At the click of a mouse, using an Amazon machine image or a template, right? It is very simple. Once you actually provision that instance, right? There is nothing different in using the Windows instance than you use the Windows instance in your data center or in your home in a small machine, right? It's the same 2003 and 2008 OS that you've been using for years, right? We have worked with Microsoft over the last few years to build a strong partnership to ensure that we, under the SPLA licensing or Services Provider License Agreement program, ensure that our customers don't have to pay upfront licensing costs from Microsoft, right? You can directly leverage the pricing that we provide you on an hourly basis and you can go on from there. We have seen some significant applications of Microsoft Windows and others coming on our platform recently. Most popular among them are web applications, .NET and IIS, that sort of stuff. We are also seeing increasing use case of SQL Server, SharePoint, Exchange, Active Directory, etc. as well, right? And noting that these practices, noting that these use cases are increasing slowly, what we have done is we have actually introduced an incredibly new slew of features on Microsoft in the last 6 or 8 months, right? Lots and lots of features. Let's kind of quickly look at them, right? First of all, we always had a T1 Micro free tier for everyone, right? For Linux, right? You still have to pay the licensing fee for Microsoft Windows, right? What we've done now is offered you a free tier for using Microsoft Windows, right? On top of which you get storage, load balancing, and some other stuff, right? But just so you know, you get completely free infrastructure, which should be a shortcut to the cloud, to actually load test or functionality test your application on a micro instance with half GB of RAM, right? We have a new product called as SQL Web Edition, for which you will not see a SKU in your on-premise data center, simply because it's only available in the cloud, right? Why this is important is, if you see the price point, it comes at an incredibly low cost, right? It's literally 1/4 of the SQL Standard Edition, right? At 16.5 cents, which you can spin up and start using SQL Server on, right? In terms of features, it's pretty much similar to your Standard Edition as well. The only requirement is your application should be an enterprise web application, right? But this should be a good place to start. Relational database, how many of you use RDS in some shape or form? MySQL, Oracle, okay. A lot of you have been asking us about SQL Server on RDS, right? RDS, for those who aren't aware, is a service in which we actually provision a database for you and actually take care of all the DBA heavy-duty administration tasks, right? Like patching, backups, provisioning it, updating it, etc., etc. We started off for quite some time using MySQL, and then we introduced Oracle. A lot of customers kept telling us that they needed SQL Server, and so we introduced SQL Server 2008 R2. As recently as last week, we released support for 2012 as well. So you can actually have support for either versions of SQL Server on RDS. Plus, we have a T1 Micro for RDS, which is a free tier, which you can get started for free as well with the new account. Similar lines, we have Elastic Beanstalk, which is sort of a PaaS platform for your applications, right? We started off again on this layer a couple of years ago by offering Java to deploy our Java applications, then moved to PHP, and now we have support for .NET as well, right? You can very easily deploy your .NET applications, let us manage it on your behalf. You could do it in a couple of ways. You could also use the AWS toolkit for Visual Studio to deploy it, right? Finally, we have a couple of new instance types, which you'll be aware of, right? We always had the original cluster compute instance with offerings for Linux, right? We then introduced something called as CC2 8x extra large instances, which actually now supports Windows as well, right? You could use this for Windows workloads for HPC, right? Or even non-HPC, because you actually get a 10 GB Ethernet connection on the console, or on the Ethernet pipe, right? M1 medium instances, right? We heard a lot of customers saying that a small instance with a couple of GBs of RAM kind of can fall short for Windows workloads, right? And then you directly had 8 GB of RAM, which was a large instance. And so you needed something in between to kind of lower the gap down, right? And so back in April 2012, we introduced something called as M1 Medium with 4 GB of RAM, wherein you can actually run Windows instances if you think the small instance type was actually short on RAM for you. Let's talk about security as well. It's obviously an aspect that you can't rest your laurels on, whether on the cloud or otherwise. I was just doing a security track on the corporate track just half an hour back, and I was reading that as well. Before you consider all these security aspects of the cloud, it is important to note that it is a shared responsibility, right? What I mean by that is you are responsible for everything that is operating system layer and above and all your applications, simply because we don't have root access to your instances, right? You manage those, right? And everything that is below, right? Right from the data center access to the physical infrastructure, the network, the hypervisors, everything, right, is managed by us operationally and security-wise, right? It's important to note that, right? Just because you're in the cloud doesn't mean all the best practices that you've followed over the years for your application and OS, could be hardening, could be patching, securing your data at rest and transit needs to stop, right? That needs to continue as well. That's no different after moving to the cloud. Right? To ensure that our side of security is, properly secured, over the years what we have done is we've undergone third-party audits from independent auditors and actually undergone security accreditations of our infrastructure, right? We are certified on ISO 27001, PCI compliance, FISMA, and so on and so forth, right? On your side, you continue doing the best practices on your Windows OS layer and your applications above that. We also provide a couple of other services like IAM and EC2 security groups, which I'll talk about in a bit, which you can actually leverage to kind of gain more granular access control. Networking and security, continuing on the topic. Networking is slightly different when you move to the cloud, simply because there are some limitations that we want to personally interfere with. There are some specific access controls that we introduce, right, purposely, to actually ensure that there's no chatter and there's no security threats, right? For example, we do not allow any sort of multicast, anycast, or even broadcast on our platform across our infrastructure, inside VPC or outside across any of our services, right? We understand in doing so, by avoiding multicast, there could be certain applications, Microsoft clustering, for example, which requires multicasting, right, will not work on a platform. And we are fine with the limitation because we understand that security is a big trade-off to do to enable multicast, right? So all kind of casts on a platform except unicast, it's all disabled by default, right? How many of you are using IAM, Identity and Access Management? Just 5, 6, okay, that is almost heartbreaking, right? If you have an AWS account, you should use IAM, right? I'm not joking, it should be compulsory. The reason is it gives you the final granular access control inside your organization, right? You have this main top-level AWS account with all the set of keys and the credentials, and then you start creating sub-accounts underneath it, right? And then you can distribute each of those accounts to each of the users inside your organization, right? It's free of cost, doesn't cost you to do anything, right? And then if an employee leaves your organization or gets fired, you just turn off his IAM user account, right? That's it, instead of actually doing a complex key management, right? Same for multi-factor authentication, right? We advise you strongly to use MFA, right? That is order for a VPN device token, so that when you're doing your authorization on the Amazon platform, it's a combination of something that you have and something that you know, instead of just using a password itself, right? For more complex workloads in bigger enterprises, we are seeing an increased use case of VPC, right? Simply because when people are migrating to the cloud, their Windows workloads, there are certain applications which for licensing reasons, complexity reasons, or even for compliance reasons, they can't move its entirety to the cloud. So what they end up doing is keep a portion of the infrastructure inside their on-premise, and then in more ways than one, either using a lease line to connect to us using Direct Connect, or a VPN connection, hardware or software, connect seamlessly to the Amazon cloud using virtual private cloud. This is the kind of architecture you will start seeing soon with many enterprises. With more and more features coming into VPC, it's as compliant as resources outside of VPC, right? One other thing you can do is, if you have various branch offices across the city or the country, you can actually have them run VPN connections to the same VPC, apart from your main data center, and create a site-to-site VPN. How cool is that, right? And there are other stuff you can do as well. Another feature we introduced recently is Elastic Network Interface, or ENI, right? This is something that we introduced in the VPC, and this is something that is almost tough and impossible to replicate inside your data center. You basically can attach more than one Elastic Network Interface virtually onto every EC2 instance, and you can actually detach it and attach it to other EC2 instances when the EC2 instance fails, right? We also give you the ability to actually now attach tens and hundreds of IP addresses to these ENIs, or Elastic Network Interfaces, right? So all of those who've been asking for running multiple SSL websites on a single EC2 instance, right, with multiple IP addresses, this is for you, right? Even using Windows 2008 R2 direct access feature, right? You need a couple of consecutive IP addresses. This will actually help you do that. Let's look at a couple of common use cases of the layered products of Microsoft. One is SQL Server, another is SharePoint, right? And let's look at a couple of case studies as well. Red Lions Hotels Corporation, for those who know, those who don't know, is basically into the hospitality industry, right? They create mobile and web platforms for frequent travelers. What they did was work with their SI called as Second Watch and actually migrated a lot of their on-premise applications onto the cloud, which included SharePoint and SQL Server 2008. Right? They did it over a period of few months, and they saw incredible cost savings to the extent of 58%. Right? And they're already planning more of their SharePoint and SQL Server from other projects in the future already as we speak. We spoke about RDS. You might be aware of a white paper that we have on our public website of running SQL Server best practices on EC2, right? Miles Ward, who's my solution architect counterpart in the US, wrote that white paper, right? If you don't actually need the headache of configuring security, optimization, performance, and throughput on an EC2 yourself, you might want to use RDS. But for some reason, if RDS does not work for you and you want more control, you could run SQL Server on EC2 as well. But just be aware of some of the nuances and some of the performance requirements, right? For example, recently we introduced something called as provision IOPS, which some of you might be aware, right? To give you a high IO throughput to your EBS volumes or elastic block store volumes, right? Along with that, we have certain instance type, 3 of those, which are actually having an optimized network throughput all the way to the EBS PIOPS volume, right? When used in combination, the specific instance type with the PIOPS EBS volumes, you actually get the throughput of about 1000 IOPS per volume, right? It's important to actually know the differences between instance type, right? M1X large might look very similar to M2X large, but it is different. M1X large has the EBS optimized throughput, whereas M2X large doesn't. So when you're running SQL Server loads on EC2, you have to ensure your EBS volume network is optimized, right? Same with network throughput, right? You have disk I/O, then you have network I/O. A lot of customers actually visualize HPC workloads when they think of the CC instances, the cluster compute instances, right? It's not necessary. You can actually run DB workloads as well, right? Because you actually get a 10 gigabyte Ethernet throughput on the network interface of the EC2 instance dedicatedly, right? How about running a master and slave SQL Server where you're doing replication, put them in the same cluster group or placement group of a cluster compute instance, and then you have a 10 gigabyte Ethernet pipe to actually do the replication for you, right? So consider these options as well. Don't assume that CC2 instances are just meant for HPC workloads. They can be meant for non-HPC workloads as well. And then when you want to increase your IOPS further to what you're getting, you might want to do RAID as well, right? That is a RAID 0 striping. EBS kind of makes you think that it is like SAN, but it's not exactly like SAN, right? Though it behaves like that. So RAID 0 is different. It actually gives you provisioned IOPS, and if you can actually increase them by the multiple factor of the number of EBS volumes you're attaching. This is a simple architecture of running a SQL Server database with a slave, with a web and app to your application. As you can see, there are 2 instances of each of them, so you're kind of good and redundant for failure. However, this is across one availability zone or across a single physical space or data center, right? How about spreading them across to multiple availability zones and making it redundant at all, right? You heard Werner speaking in the morning that it's really difficult to kind of keep building parallel data centers to achieve redundancy these days, right? It's just not feasible. Using multi-AZ, it's super simple. And the cost for this is incredibly low, right? We just charge you a nominal 1 cent per GB per month for transferring data from one EC2 instance to another across 2 availability zones, as long as you're using private IP address, right? So using that incredibly low cost, you're achieving parallel access of instances running in 2 different data centers, right? And you're good for redundancy there. How do you decide, right? If you want more control of your RDS or of your SQL Server database instance, right? Running on EC2, if your application has specific authorization issues, you're doing some proprietary replication techniques on the SQL Server, it's more complex, then you might want to use SQL and EC2. Just be aware of the nuances there and how you do the performance tuning, right? If you don't want that, you want to offload all your management capabilities onto us, then RDS is a no-brainer because we in the backend do all the performance optimization and consolidation for you, which you don't see. Let's talk about SharePoint quickly, right? Again, we are seeing a very increasing use case of SharePoint among multiple customers, including governments, right? And this includes some of these deployments in the US federal space like recovery.gov and treasury.gov. And what they've seen is by migrating their workloads like SharePoint and SQL Server onto the cloud, they've seen an incredible savings of 60 to 70%, in addition to seeing the usual cloud benefits of scalability and elasticity, right? Let's do a little exercise here, right? With SharePoint, right, if you were to design this on-premise or on the cloud, right, basic criteria is you might want to design your app server in a way that is actually redundant, right? Have a primary and standby, and actually have a load distributed across them. If you were doing it on-premise, you will probably take 2 servers and distribute it. The problem there is because you have just 2 servers, you have to account for the failure as well. So on your first server and both your servers, you can at the max go up to 40%, maybe 45%. Because if one server fails, the other one has to take over the entire load, which will go up to 85-90%, right? What you can't do on-premise and you can't do on the cloud is actually keep adding smaller instances and make the entire deployment bigger, right? By spinning up more EC2 instances, right? Now you have about 10 instances, so that now you can actually run your workloads at 80% capacity utilization, right? Across each of the instances. Because if one EC2 instance fails, the remaining 9 instances can actually take the workload of the failed 80%, right? Versus running 2 instances. So that's the advantage. VPC again a good candidate for running SharePoint. When you have a distributed architecture, lots of components, you would need some networking flexibility. So the virtual private cloud by extending your data center and creating various subnets, gateways, and route tables is a good use case for SharePoint as well. Just remember that if you're creating a really big fat system, your database performance is important. You might want to tune your SQL database accordingly. Right? One of the last pieces is licensing. Who here feels that Microsoft licensing across all products is super simple, incredibly trivial to understand and comprehend? No one? That's same as me. On the cloud, it's actually much more simpler. We have something called as an OEM license, which is actually a base licensing, which is for Windows 2003 and 2008 operating systems, right? And applicable for SQL web server as well. These are licenses that you cannot transfer from your enterprise on-premise to us, right? These are actually called OEM, because these you have to use the SPLA licensing, which is actually inbuilt in our hourly costs, right? We also have other layered products like SharePoint, SQL Server, System Center, Exchange, etc., which you could actually do a bring your own license model, wherein you actually transfer your existing enterprise license onto us, and that's acceptable. Don't assume anything if there are any specific products or services that you think is a good workload for the cloud, and you don't know how the licensing model works, get in touch with us or your Microsoft rep, right? BizSpark is exciting, more relevant for this audience because it's a startup track. For those who don't know, BizSpark is a program under Microsoft, wherein startup companies actually get access to a lot of development tools, libraries, and a lot of products by Microsoft, free of the licensing cost for the first few years. As a part of our partnership and the SPLA licensing, we have actually extended that into Microsoft BizSpark program customers as well. So you as a BizSpark customer can actually come onto a platform, and we can extend you some of the services like running Microsoft Windows 2008 and 2008 R2OS on us and not pay for the licensing, right? You already have T1 Micro, which is your shortcut to the cloud, and then now you have this. Some extra tricks and tips. How many of you here use CloudFormation? No one. Okay, 1, 2, 3, right? You should be using CloudFormation, right? Basically put, it's basically a stack replicator, right? So you actually end up building a stack, let's say in a dev or QA environment. You have EC2 instances, RDS, S3 buckets, EBS volumes, and so on and so forth. And you have this entire infrastructure stack, and you want to replicate it into production, right? CloudFormation actually does it at the click of a mouse or the execution of a JSON script. Super simple, right? All you need to do is use some of our existing templates and edit them to actually do some fancy stuff at runtime. What we're doing is increasingly bringing on more ready-made templates for you, so you don't have to write the JSON script code. You can actually take our scripts or our templates and actually edit them, right? As of now, there are about 4 Microsoft Windows-based templates. We are constantly adding more, so wait for an update, watch the space, and there'll be more updates as well, right? Let's look at a small piece of JSON script for one of the SharePoint Foundation templates, right? What this basically does is at a high level, this starts off an EC2 instance, passes on the authorization keys, right? Decides which region you're running on, and in the next step, it just passes on 3 simple commands, which is basically extracting all the SQL SharePoint 2010 Foundation binaries and the installers, installs all the prerequisites, and then installs SharePoint itself, right? It's all embedded in the SharePoint system. And you can actually edit it to add more functionality during runtime, if you wanted to. And then finally, it actually gives you the details of all the AWS infrastructure, right? What are the type of EC2 instance you're running? What is the architecture, right? 32-bit or 64-bit? What is the region that you're running in? What is the key pair that you're using for spinning up this instance? What is the kind of security groups you're using to give access, right? And then you can actually create templates and build on top of these, right? And you can have an entire stack of applications that way. So you can actually, with a click of a mouse or execution of the script, replicate environments literally, right? Which is actually tough to do, and such level of automation is actually tough to do in on-premise with Windows, right? Lastly, how many of you are responsible for backups or DR in your organization? Any system admin doing backups, DR, right? Some of you do, right? This will be interesting to you as well. Obviously, please back up your data as always. We have a couple of services that we offer you to make it simpler for you. If you've heard of a service called a storage gateway, wherein you can actually download and install a small virtual machine, which we provide, which acts as a gateway to your organization. right? So it actually consumes or actually acts as a central point to take all your data from all your application servers and then in a backend, in an optimized network throughput way, pass all the data and store it on the S3 cloud, right? So that you have backup of your data. It does automatically. The second thing is VM import, which is a cool service. Here, basically when you have all those VM instances that you're running on your hypervisor, could be Citrix, could be Microsoft Hyper-V, could be VMware ESX host as well. It basically takes those images and you can actually import it into the AWS cloud, right? So that's your backup. However, the cool thing here is as a result of doing the backup, you actually already done a process which is migration to the cloud. Because now you get the ability to run EC2 instances on the cloud seamlessly if you wanted to. So you can actually use it in two ways. We also introduced something called as export, which makes this entire process completely reversible. So somewhere down the line, if you were to switch to the cloud, run EC2 instances, and then later you would want to download those images and back to your VMware ESX host, that's possible as well. It's a completely open tool. That's it from me. Sorry for the slide. I think I actually pasted the Chennai slide just so it's written in Tamil. My apologies for the same. That's my Twitter handle. So all I will say is, if you're Microsoft users, right, please keep sharing feedback onto us through all the forums or through your sales reps or to me and our other solution architects, right? Because till you don't tell us, we won't know, right? And we will keep building features more and more for you. That's it. I think we